Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
It was a chill morning in late November, and the fog clung stubbornly to the gaslit streets of London, softening the edges of buildings and muffling the clatter of carriage wheels. I had risen early to join Holmes at 221B Baker Street, expecting the usual quietude punctuated by the occasional visitor or errant telegram. Yet there was a tension in the air that I could not ignore, a silent urgency in Holmes' movements, a restless gleam in his eyes that promised a case unlike any we had previously encountered. Holmes was seated by the window, the morning mist curling around his sharp silhouette, a pipe clenched between his teeth. The detective's long, thin fingers were splayed across a letter, his eyes scanning it with a meticulous precision that seemed almost cruel in its intensity. "Watson," he said without looking up, his voice carrying the low, commanding cadence that always drew attention. "It appears we are summoned to a matter both singular and vexing. No weapon, no witnesses, and a victim whose death baffles even the most seasoned inspectors of Scotland Yard. It is a challenge tailor-made for myself." I approached cautiously, trying to discern the details from his impassive gaze. "Holmes, you speak as though this were already solved in your mind. Surely there must be some physical evidence, some clue to guide us?" Holmes finally lifted his piercing eyes toward me, and I caught that familiar spark of triumph that preceded his most extraordinary deductions. "Physical evidence, Watson, is often a mirage in the presence of careful observation. The absence of a weapon, the absence of witnesses, these are not hindrances but invitations. Observe closely. When nothing is obvious, everything becomes significant. It is the subtleties, the omissions, the inconsistencies that reveal the truth." A brief rap on the door interrupted our discussion, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a visiting card, which Holmes seized immediately, glancing at it with the swiftness of a striking serpent. He read aloud, "Mr. Reginald Cranston, solicitor, regarding the unexplained death of Mr. Felix Montague at his residence, Belgrave Square." Holmes rose, donning his overcoat and hat with an efficiency that suggested both urgency and anticipation. "Watson, we depart at once. There is no time to lose. The Yard is baffled, the household perturbed, and the city unaware that it harbors a mystery only keen observation can untangle." The carriage ride to Belgrave Square was a study in silence and contemplation. Holmes' gaze was fixed on the fog-laden streets, unseeing yet all-seeing, while I attempted to imagine the scene that awaited us. A man dead in his own home, yet no trace of struggle, no discernible weapon, and not a soul who could recount the events. Upon our arrival, the air in the Montague residence was thick with a nervous stillness. Servants hovered near the staircase, faces pale, hands trembling, and eyes darting toward the room where the tragedy had occurred. Holmes moved with deliberate purpose, examining the drawing-room door, the rug, the arrangement of furniture, and even the curtains. He did not touch, yet every glance, every tilt of his head, seemed to absorb volumes of information. I followed him, taking notes in the manner of a dutiful chronicler, though I confess that many details eluded me entirely. "Notice, Watson," he whispered as we reached the center of the room. "The carpet has been shifted, but not in haste. A single chair is slightly askew. The desk drawer is partially open, and yet there is no sign of forced entry. Our perpetrator, if indeed there is one, is precise, disciplined, and highly intelligent. Observe further. There's no blood spatter, no weapon, and no evidence of a struggle. And yet something is missing." I frowned. "Missing? What could possibly be missing if there is no weapon and no apparent disturbance?" Holmes' lips curved ever so slightly. "Ah, Watson, therein lies the crux. The absence of what should be present often tells more than what is plainly visible. The victim's very room whispers its secrets to those who listen carefully. Let us inquire with the household, observe minute details, and trust neither assumption nor hearsay. The truth will reveal itself, but only to the patient eye and the disciplined mind. At that moment, a footman entered nervously, carrying a small envelope. "Sir, this was found on the writing desk, addressed to Mr. Montague, it appears." "Recent, sir." Holmes took the envelope, eyes narrowing as he examined the handwriting and the slight indents on the paper. "Watson, it is our first tangible clue. No matter how insignificant it may appear, every mark, every stroke, every wrinkle is a signpost to truth. It is my firm belief that within this note lies the spark that will ignite the illumination of the entire mystery. Note well, Watson, no weapon, no witnesses. Yet clues abound for those who can see beyond the obvious." As I observed Holmes' intense scrutiny, I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that always accompanies the arrival of a formidable case. The stage was set, the characters arrayed, and the city itself a silent spectator to a puzzle that promised to test every faculty of deduction and perception. Little did I know, the case of Mr. Felix Montague would challenge not only our reasoning, but the very boundaries of observation, deception, and human cunning, and only Sherlock Holmes could discern the intricate web concealed beneath the unassuming veneer of a quiet London home. Holmes unfolded the envelope with meticulous care, his long fingers brushing over the faint impressions left by the writer's hand. The paper was thin, slightly uneven at the edges, and the ink carried a faint, almost imperceptible metallic tang. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, his gaze flickering from the paper to the room itself. "The texture of the paper, the indentations beneath the ink, and the subtle pressure points, each reveals the temperament, intent, and even the hand that wrote it. The writer was deliberate, perhaps cautious, and yet left a trace of their haste in the slight irregularity of certain letters." I bent closer, attempting to discern anything myself, but the faint marks were all but invisible to my untrained eye. Holmes, however, had already noted the variance in the stroke of the M in Montague's name and the slight tremor in the signature, as though the author had been suppressing an emotion they could not fully control. "Watson, the writer was not indifferent, nor was it merely a formality. There's agitation here, concealed beneath careful phrasing. Our first clue is psychological as much as it is textual." Holmes read the note aloud, his voice measured and precise. "Mr. Montague, your time approaches. Take heed of those around you, for appearances are most deceptive. Attend carefully to your surroundings, and do not trust what is presented as truth." I felt a shiver as the words sank in. The message was vague, almost deliberately cryptic, yet the underlying threat was unmistakable. "Holmes, it is a warning," I said, though my own voice sounded uncertain. "But from whom, and why? And why was it left so openly on his desk?" Holmes' eyes gleamed with an intensity that made me uneasy. "That is precisely why we are here, Watson. The sender intended for the note to be discovered, yet the method of delivery, the handwriting, and even the paper are all calculated. No ordinary criminal leaves a trail so carefully disguised. This is the work of a mind that delights in challenge, in misdirection, and in control. And mark my words, Watson, the clues will be found not in the obvious but in the absence, the voids left where one expects evidence." We began our survey of the room systematically. Holmes moved from wall to wall, inspecting the fireplace, the bookshelves, and the ornate side tables with a scrutiny that suggested he could divine the secrets of the universe merely by touch. He tapped lightly on the woodwork, listened intently, and occasionally crouched to examine a subtle indentation in the carpet. "Watson, notice the placement of the furniture. The victim's desk is slightly angled, the chair not centered beneath it, the rug subtly displaced. These are not accidents. They indicate that the room has been entered and exited deliberately, perhaps several times. The intruder or intruders left no weapon because the act itself required none." I frowned. "No weapon? Holmes, surely you mean there is one cleverly concealed?" Holmes shook his head. "Not necessarily, my dear Watson. Sometimes the most effective instrument is the one the mind wields, unseen and unsuspected. We must be open to the possibility that the method of the crime was entirely intellectual, entirely manipulative, leaving no tangible trace. It is in the reasoning behind the act and the subtle cues it leaves that the truth will reveal itself. He approached the fireplace with renewed intensity, lifting a small, inconspicuous matchbox from the mantel. The box was empty, save for a faint smear of soot, yet Holmes examined it as though it were rare manuscript. Observe the faint residue on the edges, Watson. This indicates that something was struck and applied, though not necessarily in the conventional sense. Perhaps it was a diversion, or perhaps it was a signal. Every object, no matter how mundane, can be a repository of information if one knows how to interrogate it. From the corner of my eye, I noted the servants whispering nervously among themselves. Holmes did not glance at them, yet his deductions included them seamlessly. The household is tense, yet there is no overt guilt in any face, he murmured. Some are anxious merely from fear of circumstance, others from knowledge they do not admit. One among them, however, holds a key piece of information likely unwittingly. We must proceed with care, Watson, for a false accusation here could collapse the subtle balance of observation. Holmes then moved to the window, lifting the sash slightly and peering into the foggy street. The entryway and the surrounding alleys are of interest, he remarked. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, yet there are faint traces along the sill dust disturbed. A subtle scrape as though something was dragged. The assailant did not enter through the door, nor did they exit in haste. The act was deliberate, measured, and calculated to leave no witnesses, no weapon, no discernible chaos. It is, in every sense, an intellectual crime. I tried to follow his reasoning, my own mind racing to reconcile what seemed impossible. Holmes, if no weapon, no witnesses, no signs of entry, then how could the crime have been committed? Holmes' lips curved into that faint smile that always heralded revelation. Ah, Watson, therein lies the beauty of deduction. The apparent impossibility is itself the clue. A crime designed to appear unsolvable often carries its solution in the very details that are dismissed as trivial. Observe the note, the desk, the rug, the faint scrape on the windowsill, each is a fragment of a carefully constructed puzzle. If we attend to these fragments and sequence them correctly, the method and the motive will emerge as inevitably as dawn follows night. At that moment, a faint sound reached our ears, a soft click, almost imperceptible, as though the house itself whispered a secret to those attuned to its language. Holmes froze, one gloved hand resting lightly on the desk. "Watson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "listen. Every environment carries a signature, and even the subtlest anomaly can indicate intention. The perpetrator has left us a trail, faint as it may be, and it is our task to follow it with precision. Mark this carefully. The first misdirection is often the most convincing, and it is only by trusting observation over assumption that we shall uncover the truth." I nodded, knowing that Holmes was already several steps ahead in the labyrinth of deduction. As we began our detailed inspection of the room once more, I realized that this was no ordinary crime. It was a challenge to intellect, a puzzle designed to confound all but the most disciplined mind. And I knew, with both trepidation and awe, that only Holmes could untangle the web of subtle manipulations and hidden motives that now enveloped the life of Felix Montague. Section 2 sets the stage for early investigation, subtle clues, and the intellectual tension that will carry the story forward. Holmes turned from the window and swept the room with his keen eyes, taking in every detail once more, as though the house itself were a text to be read. "Watson, the next step is to speak with those present at the household at the time of Mr. Montague's demise. While the servants may offer no direct account of the crime, their observations, habits, and even omissions can yield vital information. Attend closely. Truth is often hidden in what is left unsaid." We began with the footman, a young man named Harris, whose hands trembled as he recounted the events of the previous evening. I heard nothing unusual, sir," he stammered. "The master retired early, as was his custom, and the household was quiet. I did my rounds and found everything in order." His voice faltered, and Holmes' sharp gaze fixed upon a faint smear of soot on the collar of his jacket, one so slight that I would have overlooked it entirely. "Curious," Holmes murmured, noting the tiny mark. "Harris, did you notice anything unusual in the fireplace last evening? Any disturbances?" The young man hesitated, then shook his head, his eyes darting nervously toward the others. Holmes' lips curved slightly. "Fear does not absolve omission. Observe, Watson. The soot on his collar is minor, yet its presence here, combined with his hesitation, suggests proximity to some minor activity near the hearth. Whether intentional or accidental, it is a point of interest." Next, we spoke with Miss Ethel Davenport, Montague's housekeeper, whose demeanor was composed yet alert. "I noticed nothing amiss, Mr. Holmes," she began, though her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her apron. "All rooms were locked and in order when I retired last night. I cannot imagine how—" Holmes interrupted gently, his tone mild but insistent. "Miss Davenport, might I request a precise accounting of the keys to the residence and the sequence in which you verified the rooms?" She nodded and recited the routine, including a careful notation of which keys she carried personally and which were entrusted to the servants. Holmes' brow furrowed. "So the main door was secured, yet the window to the study shows faint marks upon the sill. That is consistent with our earlier observation, Watson. Someone entered or exited with great care, evading detection entirely, yet left the slightest trace. Observe how the truth surfaces when one coordinates seemingly disconnected details. I recorded each detail with meticulous attention, marveling at how Holmes linked the physical evidence, the statements of witnesses, and the psychological profiles into a coherent preliminary picture. He paused near the fireplace once more, examining the hearth with a level of scrutiny that made me uneasy. Harris may have been present near this area, or he may have handled some object unknowingly. In either case, the footprint of activity is minimal but significant. We must also consider motive, timing, and opportunity alongside these impressions. The crime is simple in appearance yet labyrinthine in execution." Holmes then motioned toward the servants' quarters. "Watson, the minor staff often perceive matters overlooked by their superiors. Let us inquire discreetly. Their accounts may contain inconsistencies that, while seemingly trivial, illuminate the sequence of events. Remember, it is the smallest divergence from expectation that often reveals the truth." In the dim light of the servants' wing, we spoke with another footman, Mr. Clifford, who displayed the confidence of someone accustomed to order but not to scrutiny. He described routine duties with precision, yet Holmes' trained gaze detected the slightest irregularity in the cadence of his speech. A slip of a phrase, a reference to Montague's habit of checking the windows before retiring, revealed Clifford's awareness of the study's peculiar accessibility. Holmes noted it silently, filing it away for later comparison. "Observe, Watson, how awareness and timing intersect. Clifford knows more than he admits, yet we must patiently correlate this with other evidence before drawing conclusions." Returning to the main room, Holmes examined the furniture once more, focusing on the desk where the cryptic note had been left. "The placement of this document is deliberate," he said. "It is positioned to be discovered, yet to suggest urgency and caution. The strokes of the handwriting indicate both familiarity and apprehension, a combination rare in conventional criminal correspondence. The author is both deliberate and anxious, a paradox, yet one that reveals their intent with exquisite subtlety." Holmes paused near the mantelpiece and tapped lightly upon a small ornamental box, the same matchbox from our initial examination. "Notice, Watson, the faint residual particles here. They do not correspond to the typical use of this object. It is probable the box was utilized in an unconventional manner, perhaps as a signaling device or a container for something minuscule yet critical. Such small details are often overlooked, yet they are the scaffolding upon which deduction is constructed. He then directed our attention to the fireplace again, now noting a hair, dark and fine, caught between the edge of a loose brick and the mortar. Watson, a human hair, not belonging to the household yet undisturbed. The intruder either did not notice it or intended it to remain, confident that no investigator would discern its significance. Observe the absence of panic and the presence of careful placement. We are dealing with a mind that anticipates the investigative process and seeks to mislead through omission rather than commission. As we reviewed the various statements and physical evidence, Holmes mused aloud, "Watson, what appears to be disorder is in fact order. What appears to be nothing is in fact everything. The complexity lies not in violence or confrontation, but in manipulation and foresight. The crime's elegance is intellectual, and its resolution requires the same precision. Every observation, every hesitation, every minor inconsistency in testimony brings us closer to unveiling the truth." By the time we concluded our interviews and meticulous room examination, Holmes had already begun to form a tentative framework of the events leading to Montague's death. "There are at least 3 distinct possibilities regarding the method of this crime," he stated, pacing with rapid, precise steps. "Yet each hypothesis must be rigorously tested against the evidence. No assumption may be taken for granted. Observe, Watson, the solution is rarely immediate, and the apparent simplicity of this case is the greatest deception of all." I realized then, as Holmes' mind raced ahead of our observations, that the true intricacy of the case was only beginning to reveal itself. No weapon, no witnesses, and a cryptic warning had set the stage for an intellectual duel with the most cunning of adversaries. And as I recorded every word, every movement, and every nuanced observation, I understood that this was a crime designed to challenge the very limits of reason, and that only Holmes, through patient deduction and relentless scrutiny, could hope to unravel it. The fog outside thickened as we prepared to leave the Montague residence, the streets of London shrouded in an almost tangible mystery. Holmes' expression was serene yet intense, his eyes reflecting the depth of his analytical anticipation. "Watson, the game is afoot," he whispered, "and every seemingly trivial detail, every overlooked fragment, will soon reveal the path to the perpetrator. Attend closely, for the first misdirection is always the most beguiling, and it is our task to see beyond it." Holmes led me back to the study, retracing every step with deliberate attention, as though each movement revealed a nuance I had previously missed. "Watson," he said softly, "our initial canvassing of the household has provided more than mere observations. It has revealed patterns, habits, and crucially, the absence of expected reactions. In criminal acts of subtlety, the gaps are as instructive as the evidence itself." I watched him examine the desk once more, noting the precise angle of the drawers and the slight indentation where Montague's wristwatch had rested. "Holmes," I ventured, "how can such small details possibly illuminate the perpetrator's identity?" He turned sharply, eyes alight with that familiar intensity. "Because, Watson, it is precisely in these details that human behavior betrays itself." The desk was cleared, yet the watch was left a token, deliberately overlooked or intentionally left as a message. The perpetrator manipulates both the environment and the observer, calculating what will be noticed and what will not. Observe that subtle indentation here. It corresponds perfectly to a small cylindrical object, perhaps a vial or a pen. Yet its absence is as significant as its presence would have been. Holmes crouched near the fireplace again, lifting the hearth grate to reveal a faint smear of soot, more pronounced than when we first examined it. "The perpetrator was methodical," he murmured, almost to himself. "They knew precisely where to leave traces and where to avoid detection. There is artistry here, Watson, a choreography of movement designed to mislead, to suggest intrusion while concealing intent. I bent over to observe, noting the faint black powder left behind, but could make little sense of it. Holmes, however, was already drawing connections. This soot corresponds to the mark on Harris' collar. It indicates proximity, yet not culpability in the direct act. It is a diversion subtle, yet effective. The assailant anticipates observation, Watson, and uses it to manipulate assumptions. We must proceed cautiously. Every interaction, every deviation from habit, must be catalogued and cross-referenced. He returned to the note, holding it against the lamplight. Watson, notice the faint shadow beneath certain words. The writer applied deliberate pressure in a non-uniform manner, an unconscious indication of hesitation or emphasis. Here, the pen pauses, there it trembles. It is both a warning and a signature, a psychological fingerprint. Our examination of the servants continued, focusing now on the more subtle household members, the cook, the maid, and a minor governess. Each claimed nothing unusual, yet Holmes identified inconsistencies, however minor. The cook, Watson, describes Mr. Montague's supper accurately, yet misstates the timing of his departure from the dining room. A trivial error, you might think, yet it conflicts with the accounts of Harris and Clifford. Such discrepancies, minor though they may appear, often reveal hidden movements or concealed interactions. Holmes moved to the window once more, leaning against the frame and peering into the fog-shrouded street below. The exterior is as significant as the interior, Watson. Observe the lack of footprints in the damp ground, yet the faint scraping on the sill suggests an object of small dimension was passed through. No ordinary intruder would have considered this, yet it is a calculated detail for someone anticipating investigation. I followed him along the length of the study, noting his unwavering attention to minute discrepancies. Holmes, do you believe the perpetrator expected us to discover these subtle signs? Certainly, he replied, his eyes scanning the walls with the precision of a hawk. The mind that commits such a crime delights in both concealment and revelation. They leave a trail, but only one perceptive enough to follow the nuances will perceive it. Consider the placement of furniture, the undisturbed objects, the inconsistencies in testimony, all are cues designed to mislead or guide, depending upon the observer's acumen. Holmes then examined the envelope again, now noting an irregularity in the fold and the faint impression of a seal previously unnoticed. Watson, see here, the crease is not uniform. It suggests that the envelope was hastily opened or resealed, and the faint residue on the flap indicates contact with a metallic object. A key, perhaps, or a small clasp. The perpetrator intended for this to be overlooked, yet it reveals careful planning. He straightened and began pacing the room, hands clasped behind his back. Our next step is to consider motive, Watson. Montague's death appears random, yet the methodical nature suggests otherwise. Someone had both intimate knowledge of the household and the foresight to avoid detection. Observe, no weapon, no witnesses, yet deliberate placement of clues. This is psychological artistry. We must hypothesize based on pattern rather than brute evidence. Holmes paused near the hearth once more, crouching to inspect the floorboards, which creaked faintly underfoot. Notice these scratches along the floor, Watson. They indicate dragging light, calculated, deliberate, possibly the movement of a small object, or the passage of a mechanism. Such minor indicators, ignored by most, point to method and intent. Our perpetrator is clever, disciplined, and deeply analytical. I found myself struggling to keep pace with his reasoning, but I endeavored to catalog every nuance. Holmes, it seems almost impossible that we will discern the culprit with so little physical evidence. He smiled faintly, that rare, almost imperceptible expression that always preceded revelation. Impossible, Watson, is a term reserved for those unwilling to see beyond the surface. Observe the relationships within this household, the patterns of behavior, the minor deviations from expectation. These, combined with the physical evidence, however subtle, will reveal motive, method, and identity. The puzzle is intricate, but not insurmountable. As evening approached and the fog outside deepened, Holmes continued to analyze every corner of the study, cross-referencing testimonies, and tracing the path of movement indicated by the minor disturbances. "Patience, Watson," he murmured. "The apparent simplicity of this case is the most cunning deception. Each element, the soot, the note, the misaligned furniture, the footprints that are absent yet implied fits into a framework that, once discerned, will illuminate the entire sequence of events. The true skill lies in observation, in the willingness to see what is not immediately evident." By nightfall, Holmes had formed a preliminary theory, though he revealed little to me. I could sense the excitement building, the thrill of anticipation that accompanies the first glimmers of solution. He had already begun to connect the psychological and physical evidence into a coherent sequence, one that would eventually expose both the ingenuity and the arrogance of the perpetrator. "Watson," he said at last, his voice soft but firm, "we have assembled the fragments of observation, and soon they will form a mosaic of clarity. The challenge is to maintain rigor, patience, and vigilance, for the misdirection is deliberate, and the true method subtle. Rest tonight with care, for tomorrow we shall begin to trace the perpetrator's movements in earnest, and the game will enter its most critical phase." I left the Montague residence with a mind filled with conjecture, notes brimming with minutiae, and a renewed understanding that, as always, Holmes saw what others could not. No weapon, no witnesses, yet a trail lay before us, invisible to the untrained eye, but already illuminated in the mind of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes rose early the following morning, already deep in contemplation, pacing the small sitting room at Baker Street with restless energy. "Watson," he said without preamble, "the preliminary observations have revealed the framework of the crime, but now we must consider the human element. Method is meaningless without motive, and intellect without desire is inert. Let us begin with those most closely associated with Montague family, friends, and trusted staff. Their interactions, habits, and hidden animosities will illuminate much more than mere physical traces." We returned to Belgrave Square, the fog lingering like a ghostly curtain over the city. Holmes moved with a predatory precision, his eyes sweeping every surface, every shadow. I followed, noting the subtle changes in his demeanor, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes when he approached the foot of the staircase, the minute adjustment of his overcoat as he paused near the drawing-room door. It was clear he was already deducing without speaking, his mind a finely tuned instrument scanning the patterns of the household. We began with the victim's cousin, a Mr. Leonard Pembroke, a man of distinguished bearing but a restless, almost nervous energy. He greeted us politely, yet his handshake was firmer than necessary, and a faint quiver betrayed tension beneath his composed exterior. Holmes observed silently, his gaze darting from Pembroke's hands to the subtle shift in weight on his feet, cataloging micro-expressions invisible to the ordinary observer. "Mr. Pembroke," Holmes began, his tone formal yet probing, "would you kindly recount your movements last evening, and particularly your interactions with Mr. Montague?" Pembroke cleared his throat, casting a glance toward the household staff before speaking. "I arrived around 6 o'clock, and we spoke briefly in the drawing-room. He seemed well, engaged in his usual correspondence. I retired to my quarters soon after, and well, I was unaware anything was amiss until the discovery of his death this morning." Holmes nodded, steepling his fingers. "And did you observe anyone entering or leaving the study during your visit?" Pembroke hesitated. "No, not precisely. Though there were servants moving about, I cannot say if any were near the study itself. I did notice Harris seemed distracted at one point, but I assumed it was a minor matter." Holmes' eyes flicked toward Harris, who was quietly standing nearby, his face pale. Minor distractions are often the progenitors of major truths, Holmes murmured. Watson, observe. Pembroke's hesitation and the mention of Harris' distraction suggest a knowledge of events not fully disclosed. The interplay of awareness, omission, and subtle emotion forms a lattice through which the method of the crime may be traced. We then turn to Miss Davenport, the housekeeper, whose demeanor remained composed yet alert. Holmes questioned her with subtlety, drawing out information about household routines, prior conflicts, and Montague's acquaintances. Each response, no matter how mundane, was catalogued, cross-referenced with prior statements, and weighed against physical evidence. Holmes noted the slight discoloration of her fingernails, the careful avoidance of certain topics, and the almost imperceptible pause before mentioning the family solicitor. The timing. Watson, Holmes whispered as we stepped aside, is critical. Davenport's recounting of evening events is precise yet incomplete. The omissions are as instructive as the statements. Each individual in this household carries of the puzzle, and it is our task to discern which fragments are genuine and which are intentionally misleading. Next, we examined the study itself in more detail. Holmes crouched to inspect the carpet near the desk, observing faint, irregular impressions invisible to my untrained eye. "Notice the pattern, Watson," he said, tracing with a gloved fingertip. "The impressions suggest movement of small objects, but not haphazardly. The path is deliberate, controlled, almost choreographed. Each step calculated to avoid detection, yet sufficient to leave a subtle narrative for the perceptive investigator." Holmes then examined the note once more, turning it over in his hands. "The pressure points, the slight tremors in certain letters, these are psychological fingerprints, Watson. The writer was both anxious and deliberate, seeking to warn and to mislead simultaneously. The interplay of intent and action is a hallmark of someone accustomed to careful planning. Observe, the absence of a weapon is not mere oversight. It is an integral component of the crime's design." I leaned closer, attempting to discern patterns, but Holmes' deductions were already racing ahead. The misalignment of the envelope fold, the faint metallic residue, the subtle disturbances in furniture placement, all converged to suggest a calculated execution rather than impulsive action. Our perpetrator understands not only method but perception. Holmes then paused near the window, examining the sill once more. "The entry and exit points are critical, Watson. While no forced entry is apparent, the faint scrape we observed suggests the passage of a small object or device. The perpetrator anticipated discovery, yet left only minimal traces. It is a clever orchestration, designed to confound investigators while leaving just enough for the trained eye." We continued our interviews with remaining staff, probing for small deviations, contradictions, and subtle tells. Each account seemed consistent at first glance, yet Holmes identified the faintest inconsistencies: a pause too long, a phrase repeated, a direction subtly misremembered. "Human observation is fallible," he murmured, "but human intent leaves indelible traces. It is these traces, however minute, that will ultimately reveal both method and motive." By afternoon, Holmes had begun forming a preliminary theory, though he revealed nothing to me. He cross-referenced the notes, the statements, and the environmental evidence, assembling a mental map of movements, psychological states, and potential strategies. "Watson, the stage is set," he said finally, with the air of a man approaching a revelation. "We have cataloged behavior, traced the environment, and identified both deliberate actions and subtle deceptions. The next step is to test our hypotheses, to observe reactions, and to introduce controlled variables that may provoke the perpetrator into revealing themselves." As we left the Montague residence, Holmes' gaze remained fixed on the fog-laden streets, his mind already tracing patterns invisible to ordinary vision. "The perpetrator is clever, patient, and bold," he said quietly. "But no mind, however disciplined, can anticipate every deduction, every scrutiny. We are now entering the critical phase, Watson, where observation must be matched by strategy and subtle misdirection confronted by relentless logic. The game, as always, is afoot. Holmes spent the evening reviewing our notes, cross-referencing every statement, footprint, and irregularity we had observed over the past 2 days. I watched in quiet awe as he meticulously arranged his mental map of the Montague household, the servants' movements, and the subtle disturbances that spoke volumes about the perpetrator's behavior. "Watson," he said finally, his eyes fixed on the flickering firelight, "the groundwork is laid. It is time to observe reactions, to introduce controlled variables that may compel our culprit to reveal themselves." The next morning, we returned to Belgrave Square under a muted London sun, the fog having lifted but leaving a damp chill in the air. Holmes moved swiftly, almost silently, toward the study. "We must prompt the household into revealing the inconsistencies they have concealed," he explained. "The most cunning minds leave clues not just in action, but in response to scrutiny. Observe how each individual reacts when questioned in a slightly altered context. Anxiety, hesitation, or overcompensation often betray guilt or knowledge beyond what they claim." Our first interview was with Horace, the young footman whose soot-stained collar had initially drawn Holmes' attention. We asked casually about his evening rounds, subtly shifting the phrasing from our prior conversation. Harris grew noticeably uneasy, glancing at the hearth as if recalling something he had tried to forget. Holmes noted the micro-expressions with precision. "The young man remembers more than he admits," he whispered. "Fear constrains, yet the mind cannot entirely suppress recognition of a deviation from routine." Notice the hesitation in his voice, Watson. That pause is a minor confession. Next, we revisited Miss Davenport, observing her handling of the keys and recounting of events with subtle variations in our questioning. Her composure wavered slightly when Holmes inquired about the study window. A faint sigh escaped her lips, almost imperceptible, but Holmes seized upon it instantly. "Watson, this is a classical error. She has allowed herself to convey a signal of awareness regarding the study's accessibility. The mind, under pressure, communicates more than it intends." Holmes then turned his attention to the cryptic note, examining it anew in the natural daylight. The irregular pressure of the handwriting, the slight tremor in certain letters, and the uneven folding, these are not merely stylistic choices. They represent conscious thought under duress. The author is hiding something, yet cannot resist leaving evidence of emotional perturbation. He tapped lightly on the envelope flap. "And this residue, Watson metallic, faint but present, speaks of a key or clasp used in the handling of the paper. A deliberate oversight, intended to mislead less attentive observers." We continued our examination of the study, scrutinizing the furniture, floorboards, and window sills. Holmes pointed to a faint series of scratches across the desk near the letter tray. "These are not the result of ordinary handling," he explained. "Someone has attempted to manipulate small objects, a vial, perhaps, or a signaling device, without disturbing the surroundings. The perpetrator is careful, disciplined, and anticipates investigation. Each trace left behind is calculated to convey or obscure information." Holmes' attention then shifted to the subtle positioning of objects around the room. "Notice, Watson, the slight displacement of the inkwell, the minor tilt of the candlestick. These are indications of activity that occurred posthumously deliberate placement, designed to suggest intrusion, while obscuring the true movements of the perpetrator. Observe how the hand of the criminal choreographs not just action, but perception." Later, he returned to the hearth, crouching to inspect the floorboards with almost obsessive precision. Here, the soot, slightly displaced. There, a small hair caught between the bricks. The footprint of deliberate activity is present but subtle. Our adversary anticipated the investigator's eye, yet underestimated the precision of observation when coupled with deductive reasoning. Holmes then led me to the kitchen. questioning the cook and maid regarding their evening routines, carefully noting micro-expressions, pauses, and incongruities. The cook's account was consistent, yet her eyes betrayed fleeting recognition when the subject of the study's window was mentioned. "There, Watson," Holmes whispered, "a momentary lapse. It is enough to suggest knowledge not disclosed. The mind speaks through hesitation as much as through words." By afternoon, Holmes had begun to construct the framework of the perpetrator's behavior, careful, intelligent, and meticulous, yet prone to subtle emotional leakage under scrutiny. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how anticipation of detection influences action. The criminal manipulates the environment to mislead, yet no human can entirely suppress the physical and psychological cues left behind. Every tremor, every hesitation, every minor irregularity becomes a beacon for the trained observer." He then paused near the study window, peering into the street below. "The points of entry and exit are minimal, yet the faint scrape we noted earlier suggests movement of an object of small dimension. Consider how each detail, the soot, the note, the minor misalignments, converges into a pattern of deliberate deception. Our task is to identify which element is crucial, which is ancillary, and which is an intentional misdirection." Holmes' intensity grew as the day wore on. He cross-referenced the behaviors of the household members, the physical traces, and the psychological cues, constructing a mental lattice that would ultimately reveal both motive and method. "Patience, Watson," he said, almost reverently. "The complexity lies not in the act itself, but in the anticipation of observation and the orchestration of perception. We must remain vigilant, for the smallest overlooked detail may prove pivotal." As evening approached, Holmes summarized his insights. "We now have a preliminary framework of movements and behaviors, and we have observed reactions to subtle tests. The criminal is clever, yet human. Their discipline masks their intent, yet cannot conceal the innate impulses that arise under scrutiny. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall introduce further controlled variables, and the weave of truth will begin to unravel. Each fragment of evidence, however minor, is a thread in the tapestry leading to the culprit's exposure." I departed the Montague residence with my notebook brimming with observations and my mind racing with possibilities. Holmes, ever calm and composed, walked beside me with eyes fixed on some distant point of deduction invisible to the ordinary observer. I understood then, as I often did, that the resolution of this crime would require more than mere observation. It demanded the full force of intellect, patience, and relentless analysis. And Holmes, as always, was already far ahead of both evidence and imagination, tracing the invisible lines that led inexorably to truth. Holmes spent the following morning arranging the household members in the drawing room under the guise of routine questioning. Yet his mind was calculating each reaction, each subtle flicker of expression. He allowed silence to dominate the room, letting anxiety and instinct surface where words could not. "Watson," he murmured, "the criminal's intelligence relies on anticipation. If we disturb their carefully maintained equilibrium, the truth will reveal itself in the subtlest cues. Observe how the ordinary mind reacts to the extraordinary." He began with Leonard Pembroke, whose polished demeanor had begun to show the faintest cracks under scrutiny. Holmes' questions were artfully casual, yet they probed areas of interest, movements in the study, recollection of unusual objects, and the timing of last evening's events. Each question was carefully tailored to provoke micro-expressions rather than overt confessions. Pembroke's lips twitched imperceptibly, and his eyes flicked toward the fireplace, betraying some inner agitation. Holmes noted with precise attention the small motions. "Watson," Holmes whispered as I scribbled notes, "often communicate more than words ever could. Look at his hands, how they twist unconsciously. Each gesture is a potential clue, an index of concealed knowledge." Next, Holmes turned to Harris, the young footman whose soot-stained collar had first drawn attention. "Tell me, Harris," he began, How often did you check the study during the evening hours? Harris shifted uneasily, his voice faltering slightly, a faint stammer betraying uncertainty. Holmes' gaze was unwavering. The pause, Watson. It signifies recognition of the anomaly in the schedule. An unconscious admission that his observations were incomplete, or perhaps deliberately concealed. Miss Davenport, the housekeeper, was then invited to recount her routine. From the closing of doors to the placement of keys. Holmes' questions were subtle, a shift in phrasing, a minor alteration in sequence. Her eyes flickered at mention of the study's window, almost imperceptibly, and she pursed her lips before resuming her narrative. Holmes noted the hesitation. "The mind reveals itself in patterns of avoidance," he said quietly. "Even the most disciplined deception leaves traces." Holmes then moved to the physical evidence, retracing our prior observations of the study. The slight displacement of the candlestick, the faintly misaligned inkwell, and the small scratches on the floorboards became part of his mental tableau, each connected to behavioral patterns exhibited by the household. Observe the choreography of the criminal, Watson. Each movement is calculated, yet no plan is flawless. Errors emerge not in intention but in execution, and these errors are our guides. He lifted the envelope once more, turning it against the light. Notice the faint metallic residue and the uneven fold. The author was aware of potential scrutiny, yet allowed a deliberate imperfection to exist. It is both a taunt and an inadvertent confession. The precision of intent combined with the fallibility of human psychology is what gives us purchase on the truth. Holmes then subtly shifted the conversation with the assembled household, introducing hypothetical scenarios regarding the night in question. If a visitor were to leave an item in the study unnoticed, who might have been present and what might they have seen? His phrasing encouraged involuntary reactions. Pembroke's hand twitched against his leg. Harris avoided Holmes' gaze entirely. Miss Davenport's fingers fidgeted with a handkerchief. Each involuntary motion was catalogued and cross-referenced in Holmes' mind, forming a mental lattice of suspicion and certainty, after an hour of careful observation. Holmes called us back to the study to review his findings. He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. The combination of physical evidence and human reaction has revealed a narrowing of potential perpetrators. The criminal is intelligent, meticulous, yet unable entirely to suppress micro-reactions under scrutiny. Each interaction, each hesitation, each physical cue builds a profile that is now sufficiently precise to guide further strategy. He returned to the window, examining the sill where the faint scrape had suggested a small object was passed through. The entry and exit are minor, Watson, yet the path is deliberate. No ordinary individual would have left such subtle indications. Consider the behavioral data. Who had access, who had motive, and who was most likely to manipulate both environment and observer. Holmes then seated himself near the desk, reviewing the note once more. The psychological fingerprint is unmistakable. Tremors in the letters, inconsistent pressure, and the slight pause between words indicate anxiety coupled with meticulous planning. This individual is both cautious and daring, familiar with observation, yet still prone to revealing their hand when challenged subtly. He finally rose, turning to me with an intensity I had come to recognize as the precursor to revelation. "Watson, the framework is set. We have identified discrepancies, traced behaviors, and linked micro-expressions to probable intent. Tomorrow, we will introduce further controlled observations, subtle manipulations designed to provoke responses that cannot be concealed. The criminal, in seeking to maintain composure, will reveal themselves through instinct and error." As we left Belgrave Square that evening, I reflected on Holmes' remarkable ability to synthesize the physical and psychological. The fog had returned, curling around the streets and lending the city an ethereal hush. I understood, as always, that Holmes had already anticipated the next move, had already plotted this sequence of revelation. The game was entering its most critical phase, where deception would clash with intellect, and the invisible threads connecting action, motive, and identity would finally begin to converge toward exposure. The investigation had evolved from mere observation to strategic orchestration. Holmes' mind was a web of deduction, each strand taut with inference, each node connected to the behavioral patterns of those around him. It was clear that within hours, the invisible architecture of the crime, the careful choreography of the criminal, would be laid bare. And in the heart of London's fog-shrouded streets, amidst minor distractions and deliberate misdirections, Sherlock Holmes was poised to uncover what no ordinary investigator could ever perceive. Holmes spent the following morning refining the subtle manipulations that would test the household members' composure. We arrived at Belgrave Square just after 9, the London fog curling around the facades of neighboring townhouses, lending the streets an otherworldly quiet. Holmes moved with his characteristic precision, his eyes scanning the building's exterior as though the very bricks contained secrets. "Watson," he murmured, "our preliminary observations have yielded a pattern. Today, we must apply gentle pressure to the human element. Minute provocations will elicit responses imperceptible to the ordinary mind, yet unmistakable to the trained observer." He began by subtly rearranging objects in the study, moving a small inkstand and tilting the candlestick ever so slightly. "The criminal is meticulous," he explained, "yet even the most disciplined individual cannot resist registering an unexpected alteration. Observe how these changes affect behavior." Our first test involved Mr. Leonard Pembroke. Holmes asked him to recount, once more, the events of the previous evening, inserting minor contradictions between questions and subtly altering the sequence of events. Pembroke's hand twitched when the altered details were mentioned, and a slight quiver in his voice betrayed tension he had not previously displayed. Holmes observed with unerring focus. "There it is, Watson," he whispered. "A fissure in composure, the faintest disruption caused by an unexpected variable. The mind resists manipulation, yet instinct cannot be completely suppressed." Next, Holmes addressed Harris, the footman. "Tell me, Harris," he said in a casual tone, "when you moved through the corridors last evening, did you notice anything unusual in the study?" Harris hesitated, glancing at the fireplace, then at the window, before responding. His gaze faltered, and his voice carried a subtle uncertainty. Holmes nodded slightly. "Notice the micro-hesitation, Watson. It is a silent acknowledgement of knowledge beyond what he has chosen to convey. Each involuntary signal is a thread in the tapestry of truth." Holmes then questioned Miss Davenport, carefully phrasing inquiries regarding keys, doors, and evening routines. At mention of the study window, she subconsciously adjusted her posture, and a flicker of recognition crossed her eyes. Holmes' penultimate expression of satisfaction was subtle but evident. She cannot completely suppress the acknowledgement of familiarity with the environment, nor the incongruence between what she recounts and what occurred. Even a disciplined mind leaves cracks under gentle pressure. After these interviews, Holmes returned to the study to reassess the physical evidence. The faint scratches on the desk, the displaced inkstand, and the minor disturbance of the floorboards had taken on new significance in light of the behavioral responses we had observed. "Observe, Watson, how environmental traces intersect with human reactions," he said, pointing at the inkstand. "The criminal's manipulation of objects was intended to mislead, yet it now guides us when paired with behavioral cues. The combination of action and reaction is most revealing." Holmes then turned his attention to the cryptic note once more, examining it under daylight. The pressure points, tremors, and uneven folds indicate anxiety intertwined with deliberation. The author is accustomed to careful planning, yet cannot entirely mask emotional disturbances when their environment is subtly altered. The key lies in interpreting both content and psychological residue. He began constructing scenarios in his mind, hypothesizing possible methods of access, potential motives, and the likelihood of collusion. "Watson," he said quietly, "the criminal anticipates scrutiny but underestimates our ability to manipulate perception. By introducing controlled variations in the environment, we provoke micro-responses that reveal both intent and culpability. The interplay of observation, deduction, and psychological pressure is our instrument." Later, Holmes conducted a final round of questioning, presenting small, seemingly innocuous anomalies: a shifted chair, a misplaced letter, a slightly ajar window. Each household member exhibited responses revealing subtle stress or recognition, from a quick glance to a tightened grip on a handkerchief. Holmes cataloged each response with meticulous care. "Observe how instinct betrays even the most careful deception," he murmured. "No matter how practiced, each individual responds uniquely to disruption. Patterns emerge, and these patterns are revealing." As afternoon approached, Holmes convened me to summarize his conclusions. "The cumulative data from behavior, environmental manipulation, and physical evidence narrows our focus considerably," he said. "We have identified those most likely to have motive, access, and the psychological profile consistent with the execution of the crime. Yet, the ultimate revelation requires one final synthesis, an orchestrated scenario that elicits a confession through natural reaction rather than forced interrogation." He paused by the window, peering out at the gray, damp streets. "The criminal is intelligent, disciplined, and patient. Yet, human instinct cannot be fully suppressed. Each minute alteration, each suggestion of incongruence, forces a micro-reaction that, when observed and interpreted correctly, illuminates truth. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall set the stage for final exposure. The network of deceit has been mapped. The invisible strings are now taut. One subtle movement, one carefully applied stimulus, will unravel the concealment and compel the perpetrator into revealing themselves." Holmes' intensity was palpable as we left Belgrave Square that evening. The fog had returned, curling around the gas lamps and damp streets, lending a silent anticipation to the city. I understood that the game had entered its most crucial phase, where strategy would intersect with instinct and perception would confront deception. Every move, every glance, every subtle reaction had been catalogued by Holmes with near-omniscient precision. As we walked back to Baker Street, I reflected on the extraordinary methodology Holmes employed. The combination of observation, environmental manipulation, and psychological pressure created a framework in which truth could not remain hidden. He had transformed the household into a living experiment, where the criminal's own discipline would become their undoing. And as always, Holmes' calm exterior concealed a mind working several steps ahead, already anticipating the final alignment of evidence and human behavior that would reveal the culprit. Beyond doubt, Holmes arrived at Baker Street that morning with a barely perceptible air of excitement, his keen eyes glinting with anticipation. "Watson," he began as we settled into the familiar sitting room, "our controlled manipulations yesterday have yielded sufficient responses to allow us to identify the first critical inconsistencies. These are subtle, almost imperceptible divergences between observed behavior and recounted events. It is in these fissures that the truth will emerge." We returned to Belgrave Square under a muted London sky, the fog now lifting to reveal damp cobblestones and gas lamps flickering in the morning light. Holmes moved with silent precision, his gaze sweeping over every detail as though even the smallest disturbance contained a clue. He first confronted Leonard Pembroke, questioning him about his observations of Harris and Miss Davenport during the evening of the crime. Pembroke's confident facade faltered when Holmes subtly mentioned the rearranged inkstand and the tilted candlestick. His eyes flickered, lips tightened, and a slight tremor in his hand betrayed more than words ever could. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, "how minor disruptions expose latent knowledge and discomfort." Next, Harris was summoned for questioning. Holmes posed the same inquiries as yesterday, but with slight modifications in phrasing and emphasis. "You reported passing the study 3 times, Holmes said casually. "Did you notice anything unusual each time?" Harris hesitated, his gaze darting nervously toward the fireplace and then the window. His voice wavered, betraying unease. Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Involuntary acknowledgement, Watson. Even the most disciplined mind cannot entirely suppress recognition of inconsistencies when challenged." Miss Davenport, the housekeeper, was then observed with the same subtle adjustments. Holmes' phrasing suggested a hypothetical scenario in which a small object might have been removed or placed in the study. Her hands twitched slightly as she clutched a handkerchief, her posture shifted imperceptibly, and her eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition at the mention of the window. "Another fissure," Holmes whispered. "Notice how instinct surfaces in the most controlled individuals when the environment is slightly altered." Holmes then examined the physical evidence anew. The faint scratches on the desk, the misaligned inkwell, and the disturbed floorboards. He connected these with the subtle reactions he had observed in the household. Each of these physical traces intersects with behavioral responses. When aligned with the psychological indicators, a lattice of probable truth begins to emerge. The criminal's meticulous planning cannot conceal the traces left by instinctive reactions. He focused next on the cryptic note, inspecting its folds, tremors, and uneven pressure. "The author intended misdirection, yet emotional stress is encoded here," he said, tapping lightly on the envelope. "It is both a warning and a confession. Tremors in penmanship, inconsistent folding, and minor irregularities betray anxiety, even among the most disciplined. The interplay of intellect and instinct is a critical factor." Holmes then orchestrated subtle controlled scenarios in the study. He repositioned objects slightly, opened the window marginally, and allowed minor changes in light to create shadows in unusual places. Each alteration was designed to provoke instinctive reactions. Pembroke's hand twitched, Harris avoided direct eye contact, and Davenport's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Holmes cataloged each movement with meticulous attention. "These micro-responses, Watson, are the language of truth. Each deviation, however small, maps the cognitive landscape of our suspect." He began cross-referencing these behaviors with known patterns of movement, access, and motive. The criminal anticipated investigation, but underestimated the precision of our manipulations. Each reaction aligns with the previously observed environmental cues. It is not merely coincidence. It is the convergence of human instinct and deductive reasoning. Holmes paused near the window, observing the street below. "Consider the points of entry and exit, the timing of movements, and the micro-expressions elicited by environmental changes. The network of deception begins to unravel, Watson. The first inconsistencies are now visible, small yet decisive indicators of deliberate concealment." He then returned to the assembled household, questioning each member again, carefully monitoring for hesitation, involuntary gestures, and shifts in tone. Pembroke fidgeted with his cuff, Harris' eyes darted toward the fireplace repeatedly, and Davenport's fingers twisted the handkerchief in a rhythm betraying internal tension. Holmes cataloged each, forming a lattice that integrated behavioral cues with physical evidence stocked by late afternoon. Holmes had identified the first critical inconsistencies, subtle deviations between reported behavior and observed reactions, discrepancies in movement patterns, and faint physical traces corresponding to instinctive responses. "We now possess the initial framework for deduction, Watson," he said, his voice calm yet infused with anticipation. "These inconsistencies provide not only identification of likely suspects, but also insight into the methods employed. The criminal's meticulous strategy leaves behind a trail, if only one knows where and how to observe it." As we departed Belgrave Square, the fog curling once more around the streets, I reflected on Holmes' extraordinary ability to synthesize the tangible and psychological. Each observed micro-expression, every tremor of the hand or twitch of the eye, was now part of a detailed map of suspicion. The interplay of human instinct, environmental manipulation, and deductive reasoning was reaching a critical point. Holmes' mind, as always, was several steps ahead, weaving the evidence and behaviors into a coherent narrative. The first fissures had emerged in the perpetrator's facade, subtle but telling. And the next stage of our investigation would press further, applying additional controlled variables to exploit these weaknesses. Soon, the criminal's meticulous composure would begin to unravel under the weight of observation, scrutiny, and strategy, leading inevitably toward exposure. The game had entered a pivotal phase. Each movement, glance, and hesitation within the Montague household now carried significance. And Holmes, with his unparalleled intellect, was poised to convert these seemingly minor inconsistencies into the revelation of both motive and method. The city's muted light and dampened streets bore silent witness to the unfolding of a masterful investigation, one where intellect, patience, and observation converged to expose truth from the depths of deliberate deception. Holmes returned to Baker Street that evening, the gas lamps outside casting long shadows across the familiar room. "Watson," he said, settling into his chair with a rare intensity in his gaze, "the first inconsistencies have provided sufficient insight into the perpetrator's methods and psychology. Yet, observation alone will not compel the final revelation. We must now employ strategic maneuvers, subtle provocations designed to induce the perpetrator into revealing themselves without suspicion." We departed for Belgrave Square at dusk, the city streets slick with recent rain and fog, curling around the buildings like a living entity. Holmes moved with a deliberate air, scanning both the environment and the household members we had previously studied. His plan was clear: combine behavioral provocation with environmental manipulation to trigger instinctive reactions that could not be consciously controlled. Holmes began with Pembroke, casually discussing the previous night's events while subtly rearranging objects on the study desk. He asked pointed questions, carefully alternating between trivial matters and details of the crime. Pembroke's voice faltered when Holmes mentioned the misaligned candlestick, and his hand briefly clenched on the armrest. "See, Watson," Holmes murmured, "instinct overcomes intention when we introduce subtle challenges to composure. This is the first step toward unmasking the individual." Next, Harris was subtly tested. Holmes introduced minor inconsistencies in recounting the sequence of events, noting each micro-expression, the slight twitch, the brief hesitation, the rapid blink. Each was catalogued meticulously, forming a psychological fingerprint of tension. The criminal attempts concealment, yet instinct betrays the facade. Observe how the young man cannot suppress recognition under subtle pressure. Miss Davenport, the housekeeper, was presented with hypothetical scenarios involving misplaced keys and doors left ajar. Her reactions were almost imperceptible: a tightening of the jaw, a shift in posture, a fleeting glance toward the fireplace. Holmes interpreted each with clinical precision. Even those trained in decorum leave trace signals when confronted with anomalies. These signals, Watson, are the threads from which the web of truth is woven. Holmes then moved on to manipulate the environment further. He adjusted the angle of the window, allowed a draft to stir a curtain, and lightly moved objects on the desk to create minor disturbances. Each alteration was designed to elicit involuntary reactions from the perpetrator while remaining innocuous to others. As anticipated, Pembroke's gaze followed the window with an intensity that betrayed heightened awareness. Harris' hand froze momentarily over the doorknob, and Davenport's fingers tightened around the handkerchief she held. Observing these responses, Holmes began formulating a hypothesis of access and method. The criminal relies on routine and the assumption that the environment remains constant. By introducing controlled deviations, we force instinctive behavior to surface. Each micro-reaction correlates with opportunity, familiarity, and culpability. Holmes then orchestrated the final layer of provocation. He subtly suggested that a crucial item, a small object originally unnoticed, had been left in the study overnight. The intention was to provoke anxiety and prompt a revealing movement or statement. Pembroke's hand twitched at the mention, and he unconsciously leaned toward the desk as though checking its contents. Harris looked toward the window, his expression betraying the recognition of the insinuation, and Davenport's eyes briefly widened. Holmes cataloged these signs carefully. Turning to me, he whispered, "Watson, note how instinct, ungoverned by conscious effort, exposes knowledge that words alone cannot convey. The interplay between environmental cues and psychological response is now sufficiently defined to narrow our focus with near certainty." He then devised a final test of behavior. A staged minor disturbance in the study. A book was left slightly out of place. A chair was moved an inch from its usual position, and a letter was subtly repositioned. Holmes observed the reactions closely. Pembroke immediately adjusted the chair and glanced furtively at the letter. Harris' hand hesitated mid-motion before straightening the book, and Davenport's fingers fidgeted nervously. Each movement, while seemingly innocuous, aligned perfectly with the behavioral patterns previously observed, creating a cohesive picture of the perpetrator's interaction with their environment. Holmes finally gathered the household members together under the pretext of recounting the day's events. He spoke calmly, drawing attention to minor details he had observed, while monitoring responses. The subtle tension he had carefully engineered began to mount. Eyes darted, hands twitched, and postures shifted, each involuntary response providing a cumulative weight of evidence. By late evening, Holmes had constructed a comprehensive profile. He had identified the individual whose behavior, micro-expressions, and interaction with environmental anomalies consistently aligned with the calculated deviations observed throughout our investigation. "The stage is set, Watson," he said quietly, his sharp eyes glinting. "Our orchestrations have forced the perpetrator to betray themselves through instinct rather than words. All that remains is the final step, exposure." As we left Belgrave Square, the city cloaked in fog and the quiet of night settling over the streets, I reflected on the elegance of Holmes' strategy. It was not force or coercion, but subtle manipulation and observation that would compel revelation. Every detail had been accounted for, each gesture, glance, and hesitation integrated into a framework that left the perpetrator with no safe concealment. Holmes' mastery lay not only in deduction, but in understanding the delicate balance between human instinct and contrived circumstance, a balance that, when applied with precision, could extract truth from the most disciplined deception. The investigation had reached its critical juncture. Holmes had set the invisible trap, and the criminal, guided only by instinct, would soon stumble into exposure. The convergence of behavioral observation, environmental manipulation, and deductive reasoning created a perfect alignment for the revelation that could only come through the mind of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes returned to Belgrave Square early the next morning. The streets still cloaked in a thin mist that lent an almost spectral quality to the city. "Watson," he said as we entered the drawing room, "we are now prepared to provoke the final series of responses that will compel the perpetrator to reveal themselves. The framework of observation, environmental manipulation, and subtle provocation has reached its apex. Today, the criminal will demonstrate the misalignment between intent and instinct." Holmes began by casually recounting events of the previous evening to the household, making minor, deliberate errors in his narrative. Each error was designed to test reactions and elicit involuntary cues. Leonard Pembroke's fingers suspended almost imperceptibly when the candlestick was mentioned. Harris' eyes darted toward the fireplace, and Miss Davenport's posture shifted, her hands tightening involuntarily on the handkerchief she held. Holmes' keen observation cataloged every motion. Combining them with prior data to form a precise behavioral map, he then introduced a small, Staged anomaly in the study. A folded note was left conspicuously on the desk, subtly different from the one previously found. The placement was calculated to attract the attention of the perpetrator, provoking a response that could not be entirely controlled. Pembroke's gaze lingered for a moment too long, and his hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the note before withdrawing, betraying instinctive recognition. Harris froze mid-step, and Davenport's eyes flickered, revealing subtle alarm. Holmes' expression revealed satisfaction, his plan unfolding exactly as anticipated. Holmes guided each household member through a series of questions designed to sound casual, yet containing embedded variables that tested truthfulness and reaction. "Tell me, Mr. Pembroke," Holmes said, "when you last observed the study, did anything strike you as unusual?" Pembroke's voice faltered, and his hands betrayed tension he could not entirely mask. Holmes turned to Harris with the same query, and the young man's lips twitched, eyes flickering toward the window. Finally, Miss Davenport's response contained the slightest hesitation, her gaze momentarily avoiding direct contact. These micro-reactions, "Watson," Holmes whispered, "cannot be fully suppressed, no matter how practiced the individual. They are instinctive, involuntary, and remarkably revealing. Each aligns with observed environmental interactions, forming a triangulated confirmation of behavior that points inexorably to the culprit." Holmes then introduced a calculated confrontation, subtly suggesting that an object of value, a minor item mentioned in the note, might still be in the room. The effect was immediate. Pembroke's hand twitched toward the desk, Harris' posture stiffened, and Davenport's fingers clenched the handkerchief. Holmes carefully observed these responses, noting the timing, sequence, and intensity of each. "The mind betrays itself when under subtle stress," he said. "Observe how instinct prevails over pretense." He led them all into the study under a pretext of review. The criminal, now under layered observation and subtle provocation, could not maintain perfect composure. Holmes waited, silent, allowing the tension to build, as if the room itself were a living instrument responding to minute deviations. Pembroke's eyes flicked repeatedly toward the window. His jaw tightened, and a faint tremor in his hand revealed internal conflict. Harris' gaze darted around nervously, while Davenport's lips pressed together, betraying anxiety. Holmes finally spoke, his voice calm yet commanding. "It is remarkable how the mind attempts concealment, yet instinct invariably betrays it. We have watched, observed, and allowed the environment to elicit the truth. It is now time for clarity." He walked to the desk and picked up the note, holding it deliberately so that the subtle discrepancies in handwriting and pressure were visible to all. "This document, combined with your reactions, and corroborated by environmental traces and behavioral patterns, reveals the author and the executor of last night's events." Pembroke's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of recognition. Harris' hand twitched once more, unable to resist the instinctive motion toward the letter. Davenport's eyes widened, and a slight exhalation betrayed surprise and anxiety. Holmes observed them all, connecting these responses with his prior deductions. The convergence of evidence, physical, psychological, and circumstantial, cannot be ignored. The pattern of interaction, hesitation, and instinct identifies the perpetrator with certainty. Holmes then addressed the room, his voice deliberate and precise. "The criminal is no ordinary observer, yet their methodical attempts at concealment have failed under systematic analysis. Behavior, micro-expressions, and interaction with altered environments form a chain of evidence that cannot be refuted. The culprit has been revealed not through coercion or accusation, but through the subtle and inexorable logic of deduction." He paused, allowing the tension in the room to settle, then turned toward the individual whose reactions aligned with the entirety of the behavioral and environmental data. "Your careful planning, your attention to detail, and your assumptions about observation have all been noted. Yet instinct, the most faithful betrayer, has provided the final confirmation. You and no other were responsible for the orchestration of these events. The guilty party, now exposed by the cumulative weight of instinctive reaction and forensic observation, could no longer maintain composure. There was a brief pause, a moment of realization, and then acknowledgement. Holmes' eyes, sharp as ever, had traced every micro-reaction, every deviation from routine, and every subtle motion, synthesizing them into an unassailable conclusion. Watson, ever amazed, observed the masterful unification of evidence and behavioral science. The criminal's ingenuity, meticulousness, and careful deception had been nullified not by brute force, but by the subtle orchestration of observation, environmental manipulation, and psychological insight. Holmes' combination of logic, patience, and acute attention to instinct had left no avenue for concealment. As the day drew to a close, Holmes reflected quietly, almost to himself. The mind is a complex instrument, Watson. Its precision is rivaled only by its susceptibility to instinct and stress. When combined with environmental observation and strategic manipulation, even the most disciplined individual cannot conceal truth indefinitely. The game is concluded, and the criminal has revealed themselves, as all must when logic is applied with rigor and patience. By the time we left Belgrave Square, the fog had settled once more, the streets quiet, and the city seemingly unaware of the resolution that had occurred within its midst. Holmes' calm demeanor masked the intense satisfaction of methodically dismantling a web of deception, using intellect and strategy rather than confrontation. The culmination of observation, subtle provocation, and deductive synthesis had brought clarity, and the culprit, exposed by their own instinct, would face the consequences of actions that no skill could fully conceal. As the last vestiges of daylight faded from the streets of London, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the events of the day weighing heavily upon my mind. The criminal had been unmasked, yet it was not the theatrical reveal of confrontation and accusation that marked Holmes' triumph. It was the quiet, inexorable accumulation of evidence, behavioral observation, and subtle manipulation that had compelled the truth to surface. Holmes, as always, remained calm, almost aloof. Yet I detected a faint spark of satisfaction in his eyes. We entered the sitting room, and Holmes immediately set about organizing the notes, observations, and environmental data he had meticulously cataloged over the past several days. Each micro-expression, every subtle gesture, the rearrangement of objects, and the sequence of instinctive responses now formed a coherent framework that chronicled the method by which the crime had been committed and the manner in which the perpetrator had attempted to conceal it. "Watson," he said, "the culmination of deduction is not merely in identifying the guilty party, but in understanding the intricate interplay between intention, environment, and instinct. Today we have witnessed the mind's own admission, revealed through behavior rather than confession." I watched as Holmes reconstructed the sequence of the crime, detailing how each action, each seemingly inconsequential choice by the perpetrator, had contributed to the puzzle. The note left on the desk, the displaced candlestick, the subtle scratches on the floorboards, all were interwoven with behavioral cues to form an irrefutable lattice of evidence. "Notice, Watson," he explained, "how even the most disciplined attempt at concealment is betrayed when faced with carefully orchestrated variations in environment. The mind, under subtle stress, cannot resist instinct. Herein lies the elegance of our method." Holmes then reflected on the psychological profile of the criminal. An individual of considerable intellect, meticulous and cautious, yet not immune to instinctive responses. Their planning was precise, but the micro-variations we introduced revealed the unguarded reactions that ultimately confirmed identity. It is a reminder, Watson, that intellect and cunning, though formidable, are perpetually balanced against the inevitability of human nature. I could not help but admire the depth of his insight. The investigation had been methodical, almost surgical, with each stage building logically upon the previous, leading inexorably to the final unmasking. It was not simply deduction. It was a synthesis of observation, behavioral science, and strategic manipulation, a demonstration of Holmes' unparalleled skill. As evening deepened into night, Holmes began to draft a formal account of the case, his handwriting precise and deliberate. The final report, he mused, will not only serve Scotland Yard and the legal authorities, but will also stand as a testament to the rigorous application of logic and observation. Each step, each clue, and each behavioral indication has been preserved with care, ensuring that the methodology may be appreciated by those who study the art of deduction. We spoke briefly of the household we had left behind, reflecting on the subtle tensions and unguarded moments that had ultimately led to revelation. "There is a lesson here, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "Deception, no matter how artfully executed, must contend with the involuntary responses of the human mind. Opportunity, motive, and instinct converge in ways that even the most meticulous cannot fully control. Our work today illustrates that principle with clarity." Holmes then allowed himself a rare pause, reclining in his chair and gazing thoughtfully at the fogged windows. The criminal's exposure is complete, yet the city remains indifferent. London will sleep tonight unaware that another thread of its complex social fabric has been unraveled. It is in this quiet, Watson, that true accomplishment is often found, where intellect, patience, and observation align to reveal hidden truths without fanfare. I took a moment to reflect on the extraordinary orchestration of the investigation. Every element, behavioral observation, environmental subtlety, and deductive reasoning had been applied with precision, each stage leading logically to the next. The cumulative effect had been a seamless unraveling of deception, a revelation achieved not through confrontation or force, but through the quiet, deliberate application of Holmes' extraordinary mind. Holmes, observing my contemplative silence, spoke again. "Do not underestimate, Watson, the importance of subtlety in such matters. The mind betrays itself, as we have seen, and yet recognition of these betrayals requires patience, insight, and disciplined attention. The criminal, though clever, was ultimately outmatched not by force, but by the silent mechanisms of observation and the inexorable logic of deduction." As the hours passed, we reviewed the final sequence of events, ensuring that every observation aligned with the conclusions reached. The criminal had been apprehended, the sequence of actions reconstructed, and the behavioral responses documented as evidence. Holmes smiled faintly, a rare gesture of satisfaction. "It is finished, Watson. The case concludes not in spectacle, but in the quiet triumph of intellect applied with rigor. The criminal has been exposed, and the integrity of deduction reaffirmed." I marveled at the elegance of the resolution. What could have been a chaotic tangle of deception had been rendered transparent through meticulous observation, strategic manipulation, and relentless logical reasoning. Holmes' mastery lay not merely in seeing what others missed, but in orchestrating circumstances that revealed the truth without coercion. Finally, as the lamps were dimmed and the city outside settled into the stillness of night, Holmes allowed a moment of reflection. "There will always be new puzzles, Watson. Each mind is a labyrinth, each action a potential clue. Today's success is but a testament to the methods we employ. Patience, observation, and deduction. These are the tools that pierce the veil of human concealment." I felt a profound sense of admiration for my friend, recognizing the unparalleled skill that had transformed subtle, human behavior and minor environmental cues into an unassailable narrative of truth. The case was complete, the criminal exposed, and yet the lessons extended beyond the immediate events, a study in the interplay between intellect, instinct, and circumstance, and the power of careful observation to reveal what even the cleverest attempt to hide. Holmes, settling back in his chair with a thoughtful expression, finally allowed a hint of his characteristic understatement. Another puzzle solved, Watson. Yet we move forward, for the world offers endless mysteries. And the mind, when disciplined, finds both satisfaction and challenge in their pursuit. The night drew on, and I felt the quiet closure that accompanies the resolution of a case handled with consummate skill. The city slept, unaware of the careful logic, subtle provocation, and relentless observation that had unmasked a criminal. And in the calm of Baker Street, Holmes' mind already turned toward the next challenge. The next thread of deduction waiting patiently to be untangled. The morning that followed was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if London itself were holding its breath in deference to the resolution that had quietly unfolded. Holmes and I walked the familiar streets to Baker Street, the fog lingering like a curtain, softening the city's harsh edges. In the open, the events of the previous days felt surreal. Yet each detail remained vividly etched in my memory, the subtle twitches, the fleeting glances, the almost imperceptible hesitations that had betrayed the criminal. Once inside 221B, Holmes moved to the window, studying the street below with his usual intensity, though there was a faint, almost imperceptible satisfaction in his gaze. "Watson," he said, turning at last from the panes of glass, "there is a certain poetry in the conclusion of such a case. The threads of deception, when carefully traced, inevitably lead to truth. Yet it is never the overt act that reveals the criminal, but the minute, instinctive betrayals that escape even the most meticulous mind." I watched him as he began reviewing his notes, arranging the observations and evidence with the precision of a master artisan. Each behavioral cue, every shifted object, and all inconsistencies in timing were documented and cross-referenced, forming an unassailable web of logic. The criminal believed themselves cautious, clever, and unassailable, Holmes continued. Yet instinct, that most faithful betrayer, has a manner of overriding even calculated intention. We observed, provoked subtly, and allowed natural responses to illuminate the truth. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly as he recalled specific moments from the investigation. "Consider the candlestick, Watson. A trivial object, yet its displacement revealed so much. A hand hovering, a glance diverted, a brief twitch, each insignificant alone. But together, they narrated a story far clearer than any confession could provide. This, Watson, is the essence of observation. The truth lies not in what is spoken, but in what cannot be fully controlled." Holmes turned to me with an expression of rare reflection. "The culmination of deduction is not merely in apprehending a criminal, but in restoring order to a fractured narrative. Every suspect, every clue, every environmental variable has its place, and once aligned, they form a coherent, irrefutable truth. Today, that truth has been realized." I felt the weight of the case settle, the tension dissipating now that resolution had been achieved. Holmes' methodical orchestration of environment and psychology had ensured that justice was served without spectacle or coercion. The criminal, exposed by instinct and circumstance, would face the consequences of actions that no careful planning could ultimately conceal. For a long moment, Holmes was silent, the faint hum of the city outside filling the room. "Watson," he said finally, in that calm yet commanding tone I had come to recognize, "each case leaves its lessons not merely in deduction, but in understanding the human mind. Observation, subtlety, patience, these are the tools that pierce the veil of concealment. And yet, even mastery must be tempered with reflection. Without reflection, even the most brilliant deduction is incomplete." I nodded, struck by the depth of insight, aware that the resolution was as much about understanding human nature as it was about solving a puzzle. The criminal's exposure was complete, but the lesson extended beyond the immediate events. Every deception carries its own signature, and even the cleverest attempts at concealment are vulnerable to fulcrum, disciplined observation, and reasoned strategy. Holmes reclined in his chair, a rare, almost imperceptible smile playing upon his lips. Another mystery laid bare, Watson. Yet do not grow complacent. The city teems with puzzles yet unsolved, and the mind that seeks truth must remain vigilant. Today we celebrate resolution, but tomorrow brings new intrigue, new challenges, and new opportunities for deduction. As I reflected on the investigation, I marveled at the elegance with which Holmes had orchestrated the entire affair. The criminal had been revealed not through force or confrontation, but through the quiet mastery of observation, strategy, and patient deduction. Every gesture, glance, and movement had been noted, every environment subtly manipulated, until instinct betrayed intention, and the web of deception unraveled completely. The streets of London outside were now bathed in morning light, the fog lifting as if to signal a return to normalcy. Within Baker Street, however, the echoes of the case remained, a testament to the meticulous mind of Sherlock Holmes and the inexorable power of logic and observation. Holmes, ever composed, already turned his attention to the future, to the next puzzle waiting patiently in the shadows of the city. And as I sat back, recording the final details for posterity, I understood fully that the true triumph lay not only in solving the crime, but in witnessing the quiet, precise unfolding of a mind capable of transforming complexity into clarity, confusion into insight, and mystery into reason. In the world of shadows and subtle truths, only Sherlock Holmes could illuminate what others could not even perceive existed: the case of no weapon, no witnesses. Only Sherlock could solve it, was concluded, leaving behind a record of intellectual mastery, human observation, and the subtle artistry of deduction, the very hallmarks of Sherlock Holmes' enduring brilliance.